The Potomac River, near Washington, D.C. October 7th, 1903. A strange machine stood on a platform above the water. It was called the aerodrome, and the man behind it was no ordinary inventor. His name was Samuel Langley. He was one of America's most respected scientists and the head of the Smithsonian Institution. The United States government had given him thousands of dollars to build a machine that could carry a person through the air. Everyone was watching. Journalists waited along the river. Photographers prepared their cameras. This was supposed to be the future of flight. Then came the moment. The machine was launched. It moved forward, left the platform, and almost immediately crashed into the river. The newspapers were brutal. For many people, the dream of human flight still seemed impossible. But while famous scientists were struggling with expensive machines, two unknown brothers were working quietly inside a small workshop in Dayton, Ohio. They had no government funding, no university degrees, and they weren't professional engineers. They repaired and sold bicycles. Their names were Wilbur and Orville Wright. And just 69 days after Langley's machine fell into the Potomac, one of their machines would rise from the ground under its own power with a man aboard and land safely.
So how did two bicycle mechanics succeed where some of the greatest minds of their time had failed? What did the Wright brothers understand about flight that others had missed? And how did a small bicycle workshop help change the way humans travel forever? This is the story of the Wright brothers. Welcome to TalePath English. To understand how they did it, we need to go back. Long before Wilbur and Orville Wright thought seriously about airplanes, they were fascinated by machines. They grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a family that encouraged curiosity. Their father often brought books and unusual objects into the home. One day, he brought his sons a small flying toy. It was simple: two small propellers, a light frame, and rubber bands that provided the power. When released, it flew into the air. The toy eventually broke, but the brothers never forgot it. As they grew older, their interests changed. They worked with printing presses. They built and repaired bicycles. And they learned an important lesson. When a machine didn't work, you didn't simply give up. You studied it, you changed it, and you tried again. That way of thinking would become more important than any university degree. By the 1890s, bicycles had become extremely popular in America. Wilbur and Orville saw an opportunity. They opened a bicycle business in Dayton. They sold bicycles, they repaired them, and eventually they built their own. To most people, this had nothing to do with flying. But the bicycle shop gave the brothers something extremely valuable: practical experience. They learned to work with metal, wood, chains, gears, and lightweight structures. They also understood something every cyclist knows. A bicycle does not stay balanced by itself. The rider must constantly make small adjustments. And slowly, the brothers began thinking about another machine that would also need balance and control: a flying machine. By 1899, their experiments had begun. The Wright brothers were not the first people who wanted to fly. Inventors had been experimenting with flying machines for years. Some focused on powerful engines. Others tried to design better wings. But Wilbur and Orville became interested in a different question. How would the pilot control the machine once it was in the air? Think about riding a bicycle. Moving forward is not enough. You must remain balanced. You must turn. You must react when something changes. The brothers believed an airplane would need the same kind of control. They watched birds. They studied how birds changed the position of their wings. And they began experimenting with a technique that became known as wing warping. By twisting the wings slightly in opposite directions, they could help control the aircraft's movement from side to side. Before building a full-size aircraft, they tested the idea on a kite. It worked. They had taken their first important step toward controlled flight.
Now, they needed somewhere to test a larger machine. Dayton was not ideal. They wanted strong, steady winds, wide open spaces, and soft ground that might make crashes less dangerous. After studying weather information and exchanging letters, they chose a remote place on the coast of North Carolina, Kitty Hawk. When they arrived in 1900, they found enormous sand dunes, powerful winds, and very few people. It was uncomfortable. The weather could be difficult. The sand seemed to get everywhere. But for two men trying to learn how to fly, it was almost perfect.
Their first experiments did not produce a miracle. They built gliders and tested them again and again. Some things worked. Others didn't. The wings did not always produce as much lift as their calculations predicted. The brothers returned to Dayton with more questions than answers. In 1901, they came back with a larger glider. But once again, the results disappointed them. For a moment, Wilbur wondered whether humans might not achieve practical flight during his lifetime. This could have been the end. They had spent time, money, and enormous effort, and some of the information they had trusted seemed to be wrong. But instead of abandoning the problem, they made a decision that would change everything. They would test the numbers themselves.
Back in Dayton, the brothers built something that looked surprisingly simple: a wooden box. Inside it, air moved across small model wings. Today, we call it a wind tunnel. Wilbur and Orville tested many different wing shapes, again and again. They carefully measured lift and drag. And their experiments confirmed something important. Some of the aerodynamic information they had been using did not give them the results they needed, so they created their own data. This was one of the secrets behind their success. They didn't continue trusting an answer simply because an expert had written it. When the evidence disagreed, they tested the evidence. Then they changed the design.
Armed with better information, the brothers returned to Kitty Hawk in 1902. Their new glider was different. And this time, the results were dramatically better. They performed hundreds of glides. They learned how the aircraft behaved. They improved their system for controlling it. The problem of flight was becoming clearer. The brothers were learning to control movement in 3 dimensions: up and down, side to side, and left and right. This was crucial. A machine that could leave the ground was not enough. A useful airplane had to be controlled. By the end of 1902, the brothers had developed a glider they could control successfully. But one enormous problem remained. Their aircraft could glide,
Now, they needed it to fly under its own power. Finding the right engine created another problem. The brothers needed enough power to move the aircraft, but the engine also had to be light. When they could not find exactly what they needed, they turned to a talented mechanic who worked with them, Charlie Taylor. Together, they built a 4-cylinder engine. But an engine alone would not solve the problem. The brothers also needed efficient propellers. There was little useful information available for designing airplane propellers. So once again, Wilbur and Orville worked through the problem themselves. They realized that a propeller was, in a way, a rotating wing. Using what they had learned from their wind tunnel experiments, they designed their own. Piece by piece, the first Wright Flyer was taking shape. By the autumn of 1903, they were ready. The new aircraft was enormous compared with their earlier machines. Its wings stretched about 40 feet from one side to the other. It carried their engine, 2 propellers, and the control system they had spent years developing. They packed the machine in pieces and returned once again to North Carolina. There, surrounded by sand and wind, they assembled it. The machine became known simply as the Flyer. Years of experiments had led to this moment, but nothing guaranteed that it would work. On December 14th, 1903, the brothers were ready for a serious attempt. They tossed a coin to decide who would fly. Wilbur won. The Flyer moved along its launching rail, rose into the air, then climbed too sharply. It stalled and crashed into the sand. The machine was damaged. They had come so close, but once again, failure. They repaired the Flyer and waited. 3 days later, the wind was strong, very strong, but the brothers decided to try again. This time, it was Orville's turn. December 17, 1903. The morning was cold. The wind was blowing hard across the sand. Only a small group of people was there to witness what happened. At 10:35 in the morning, Orville lay at the controls. Wilbur stood beside the aircraft. The engine was running. The propellers were turning. The restraining wire was released. The Flyer began moving along its rail. Wilbur ran beside it. Then, the machine left the ground. Not because it had been thrown into the air. Not because it was falling from a hill. Its own engine was pushing it forward. Orville was controlling it. For 12 seconds, the Flyer remained in the air. It traveled about 120 feet. Then, it came down onto the sand. 12 seconds. Shorter than many people take to walk across a room. But those 12 seconds marked the world's first successful, controlled, sustained flight of a powered, heavier-than-air aircraft. And almost nobody was there to see it. But the story did not end with that first flight. The brothers flew 3 more times that day. Each time, they learned more. On the 4th flight, Wilbur remained in the air for 59 seconds. He traveled 852 feet. Then, after the flights were finished, a powerful gust caught the Flyer. The machine was badly damaged. It would never fly again. But it didn't need to. It had already proved the idea worked. Human beings could build a powered machine, control it, fly it, and land it.
The problem was no longer whether humans could fly. The question now was, how far could they go? You might imagine that the Wright brothers immediately became famous. They didn't. News of their achievement spread slowly. Many people were skeptical. After all, extraordinary claims about flying machines had been made before. And the brothers themselves were careful about revealing too much while they worked to protect and improve their invention. So they returned to Ohio. They kept experimenting. Their aircraft became more capable. Their flights became longer. And by 1905, they had developed a practical flying machine that could remain in the air much longer and make controlled turns. Still, much of the world had not seen what they could do. That would eventually change. By 1908, there was no longer much room for doubt. The Wright brothers began making public demonstrations. Wilbur flew in France. Orville demonstrated their aircraft for the United States Army. Crowds watched machines turn through the sky under a pilot's control. Journalists reported what they saw. The unknown bicycle mechanics from Dayton were unknown no longer. The world finally understood. The age of the airplane had begun. So let's return to the question we asked at the beginning. How did two bicycle mechanics succeed where famous scientists and well-funded projects had struggled? There wasn't one secret. There were several. They understood that control was as important as power. When existing information didn't match their experiments, they measured things themselves. When a glider failed, they changed it. When they couldn't find the engine they needed, they built one. When there wasn't enough information about propellers, they developed their own solution. And perhaps most importantly, they didn't treat failure as proof that the dream was impossible. They treated failure as information. Every unsuccessful experiment told them something, and every answer brought them a little closer to the sky. The first flight lasted only 12 seconds. Today, airplanes can remain in the sky for hours. They cross oceans, connect continents, carry millions of people around the world. Aircraft transport medicine, food, and emergency supplies. They bring families together. They allow us to reach places the Wright brothers could only have imagined. And the story has traveled even farther. In 2021, a small helicopter called Ingenuity made the first powered, controlled flight on another planet, Mars. Attached to it was a tiny piece of material from the wing covering used on the Wright brothers' 1903 flyer. A small piece of the machine that helped humans learn to fly on Earth had traveled to another world. Before we finish, let's review 5 useful words from today's story. Experiment, a test used to discover or learn something. Control, the ability to direct how something moves or works. Failure, a situation in which something does not succeed. Evidence, information that helps show whether something is true. And determination, the decision to keep trying even when something is difficult. Now let's put them into context. The Wright brothers performed experiment after experiment. They discovered that control was one of the most important problems in flight. They didn't allow failure to stop them. They studied the evidence from their tests. And their determination helped them continue until their machine finally flew. Now it's your turn. The Wright brothers failed many times before they succeeded.
But instead of seeing failure as the end, they used it as evidence to understand what they needed to change. Think about something difficult you would like to achieve. Do you think failure can sometimes help us succeed? Why or why not? Try to use at least 2 of today's vocabulary words in your answer: experiment, control, failure, evidence, determination. I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching this story on TalePath English. If you enjoyed discovering how 2 bicycle mechanics helped change the history of transportation while practicing your English, subscribe for more fascinating stories from history. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep following the path.